On October 19, 1781, a 23-year-old French nobleman stood in a field outside Yorktown, Virginia, and watched the British surrender. His name was Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette. He had arrived in America 4 years earlier, with no army, no official orders, and no standing beyond the money in his own pocket. His English was limited. He had never led men in battle before. The Congress he walked toward had no idea he was coming. Now he stood at Yorktown in the uniform of an American major general, commanding one of the 3 divisions of the Allied force that had just cornered the most experienced British field army in North America against a river and ground it into submission over 3 weeks of siege. Cornwallis did not come out himself. He claimed illness, and perhaps he was genuinely ill, though the timing did not go unnoticed by the officers watching from the Allied lines. He sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to deliver the sword. O'Hara rode toward the Allied commanders and turned first toward Rochambeau, the French general, as though offering the surrender to France rather than to America. Rochambeau gestured him toward Washington. Washington, following protocol, directed O'Hara to General Lincoln, his own second-in-command. The sword changed hands without ceremony. The British regiments marched out between parallel lines, French soldiers on one side, Americans on the other. Some turned their faces away. Some wept openly. 8,000 professional soldiers, the finest British force the Southern Theater had produced, filed out of their fortifications with their colors cased and their drums beating, and almost none of them met the eyes of the men watching. Lafayette watched all of it. His father had been killed by British fire at the Battle of Minden in 1759. Lafayette was 2 years old. He had carried that for 21 years across 2 continents. If you want to understand how a teenager with no military experience, no official orders, and no country behind him helped end a revolution, and what it actually cost him, stay with me. Because the story is not what anyone expected, including Lafayette himself. That was October of 1781. Here is how it began. France, in 1777, was the wealthiest country in Europe and one of the most rigidly stratified. A place where a young man's entire future was determined before he was old enough to have opinions about it. Gilbert du Motier had no complaints about how the system had arranged his particular future. He was 19 years old, one of the richest men in France, married to a woman from one of the country's most powerful families, and living in a version of Versailles society that most of his contemporaries would have traded everything they owned to inhabit. He had estates. He had titles. He had a wife, Adrienne, whom he had married at 16, and to whom he wrote letters of extraordinary tenderness. Letters that survive today, still readable, still specific about what he missed and what he feared and what he hoped for. He was not a man who kept his feelings at a distance. He was also, by every account, slightly awkward in the formal social machinery of Versailles. Not stupid, he was clearly not stupid, but not the kind of brilliant, cutting social performer that French court life rewarded most obviously. He was earnest in an environment that treated earnestness as a form of naivete. He meant things he said. That was not always an advantage. In August of 1776, at a dinner in Metz hosted by the Duke of Gloucester, the brother of King George III visiting France, Lafayette heard about the American Revolution for the first time. Not in the abstract ideological way that the revolution was discussed in Parisian salons, but in specific detail. What the Americans were fighting for, what they were fighting against, and how badly they were losing. He decided that night he would go. Pay attention to that, because it is not how military decisions normally work. He had no military experience beyond the ceremonial. He had never heard a shot fired in anger. He was 19 years old and had spent his entire life in the kind of comfort that makes danger abstract. And he heard about a war on another continent being fought by men he had never met against an empire that had killed his father when he was 2 years old. He decided that night. The decision was not rational. It was not strategic. It was not the kind of thing that a careful assessment of risks and opportunities would have produced.
It was the decision of a young man who had been waiting his entire life for something worth doing and had just found out what it was. The problem was that King Louis XVI did not agree. France was officially neutral in the American conflict and desperate to remain so, at least publicly, at least for now. Allowing a French nobleman of Lafayette's visibility to sail openly for America would be a diplomatic incident Britain would not ignore. Louis issued a formal order for Lafayette's arrest before he could board a ship. Lafayette hid in a barn in Spain. Then, in the dark before dawn on March 26, 1777, he slipped away aboard a ship he had purchased with his own money, La Victoire, and sailed west. He was 19. He was one of the wealthiest men in France. He was a wanted man. He was heading toward a revolution with no idea what it would ask of him.
Lord Cornwallis had been fighting Americans for 6 years when Lafayette arrived in Virginia in the spring of 1781, and he had formed a clear opinion of what he was dealing with. He was not wrong about everything. He had beaten Gates at Camden so completely that the American general fled the field on horseback. He had taken Charleston. He had pushed through the Carolinas with a confidence bordering on contempt for the forces trying to stop him. And when he arrived in Virginia with roughly 8,000 soldiers, the most experienced British field force in North America, he looked at the 3,000 men Lafayette commanded and reportedly wrote to London that he would, in his own words, destroy the boy and end American resistance in Virginia before Washington could intervene. The boy. Lafayette was 23. Cornwallis was not cruel by the standards of his time. He was a professional soldier with a professional soldier's specific blindness. He measured the contest in terms he understood: numbers, supply lines, open field engagements, and in every category, those terms favored him overwhelmingly. What he did not measure, because it was not the kind of thing he thought to measure, was what his opponent was actually trying to do. Lafayette was not trying to beat Cornwallis in Virginia. He was trying to keep Cornwallis in Virginia until someone else arrived to beat him. This is the plan worth understanding, because it was not the plan of a soldier. It was the plan of a diplomat who had spent 4 years learning to be a soldier. After Valley Forge, after the winter of 1778, which broke men who had survived everything else the war had produced, Lafayette went home to France, not to rest, to lobby. He spent months at Versailles making the case to anyone who would listen that France needed to commit fully to the American war. Not gold alone, not moral support, but soldiers and a fleet capable of challenging the Royal Navy in American waters. He met with the foreign minister, Vergennes. He argued, pressed, and did the kind of patient political work that does not look like heroism from the outside, but changes the outcome of wars. The same king who had issued a warrant for his arrest in 1777 received him at Versailles in 1779. Louis XVI, cautious, slow to decide, not a man of bold instincts, agreed to send 6,000 soldiers under Rochambeau and eventually to commit the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse to American waters. On paper, Lafayette's return to Virginia in 1781 looked like a holding action. 3,000 men against 8,000, too weak to attack, too exposed to hold ground. On the ground, it was something more precise than that. It was a chase designed to keep Cornwallis moving south toward the coast, away from options, until the fleet arrived and the trap closed. Cornwallis kept moving. He believed he was the one choosing where this ended. He was not. The Virginia summer of 1781 was brutal in the specific way that Virginia summers are brutal. Not dramatic heat that announces itself and passes, but a wet, pressing, all-day wait that soaks through clothing before a man has walked a mile and does not lift in the evening the way heat in other places does. Lafayette marched his 3,000 men through it for 3 months. He moved constantly, because stopping meant dying. Cornwallis had more than twice his numbers, and the kind of veterans who had been fighting and winning in the southern heat since Charleston. If Lafayette stopped moving, if he planted his force on any piece of ground and invited a pitched engagement, Cornwallis would destroy him inside an afternoon, and the last American force in Virginia would be gone. So he moved. He harassed British supply columns and disappeared before the response arrived. He shadowed Cornwallis's flanks close enough to be a persistent annoyance and far enough away to disengage before the annoyance became a trap. He marched his men hard in the early morning before the heat built, rested in the worst of the afternoon, and moved again in the evening. He wrote to Washington in letters that were characteristically honest about what he was doing and what it cost. His men were exhausted. Their shoes were disintegrating. He was paying for supplies out of his own pocket when Congress's requisitions came back empty, and he was not sure how long he could keep them in the field. He kept them in the field. In early July, Cornwallis tried to end it. He was moving his army across the James River at Jamestown Ford, a crossing that would take time and leave his rear guard exposed, and he set a trap. He concealed the bulk of his force in the tree line north of the crossing and sent a small screen of soldiers to the far bank, visible and apparently vulnerable, designed to look like a rear guard. The message was clear. Here is your chance. Come get us while we're split across the river. Lafayette almost took it. He moved toward the apparent opportunity, and his advance units engaged what looked like a covering force. Then something made him stop. The ground was wrong. The British response was too confident, too quick. He pulled his men back, 30 minutes before Cornwallis's concealed force came out of the tree line to close the trap. If he had pressed that attack, if he had committed his full force across that ground, Cornwallis would have had him. 3,000 Americans caught between a river and 8,000 British veterans, with no room to maneuver and no way out. The Virginia campaign would have ended in a single afternoon on the north bank of the James River, and the Yorktown trap that was already being planned in Washington's correspondence would never have had anything to close around. He pulled back. The trap closed on empty ground. Cornwallis moved toward the coast. He occupied Yorktown in August, established his base there, and began constructing fortifications on the peninsula between the York and James rivers. He had asked London for reinforcements or evacuation by sea. He expected one or the other. On September 5th, Admiral de Grasse's French fleet of 24 ships of the line engaged the British fleet under Admiral Graves off the Virginia Capes and drove it back to New York. The sea was closed. Lafayette received the news and understood immediately what it meant. Cornwallis had 8,000 men, a fortified position, and no way out. The boy had kept him there long enough. Washington arrived at Yorktown in late September with the combined American and French force, and for the first time in the war, Lafayette was not the senior commander present. He stepped back into his division command without complaint and without drama, which was noted by the officers around him as the kind of thing that is easier to describe than to do. The siege was methodical. Cornwallis had built his defenses well. A perimeter of redoubts and earthworks on the high ground above the river, positioned to make any direct assault expensive. Washington opened the first parallel trench on the night of October 6th, extending it toward the British lines under fire, and the artillery that moved into position over the following days began the slow work of dismantling everything Cornwallis had built. Cornwallis wrote to London asking for relief. No relief came. By October 14th, 2 British redoubts, numbered 9 and 10, were blocking the extension of the Allied siege lines, and needed to be taken. Washington assigned the American assault on Redoubt 10 to Lafayette's division. Lafayette gave the actual command of the storming party to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, who had been requesting a combat command for months and who took his men over the parapet in darkness with unloaded muskets and fixed bayonets, moving fast enough that the British defenders did not have time to organize a response before the Americans were already inside. The redoubt fell in under 10 minutes. Cornwallis attempted a breakout across the York River 2 nights later, loading soldiers onto boats in the dark, trying to move his army to the Gloucester Point shore where a gap in the Allied lines might have offered an escape route north. A storm came up while the crossing was half complete and drove the boats back. When the storm cleared, he tried again. The window had closed. On the morning of October 17th, 4 years, 4 months, and 11 days after a 19-year-old Frenchman had sailed from Spain in the dark aboard a ship he had bought with his own money, a British drummer appeared on the Yorktown parapet and beat the signal for a parley. The war was over. The news reached London in late November of 1781, carried by ship, and the government that received it was not prepared for what it meant. Not because the defeat was unexpected. There had been enough bad news from America over 6 years to prepare a reasonable man for more bad news. What the British government was not prepared for was the scale of the strategic collapse that Yorktown represented. Cornwallis had not lost a skirmish. He had not lost a province. He had surrendered the entire British Southern Army, 8,000 professional soldiers, the force that had taken Charleston and Camden and driven through 2 states, to a combined Franco-American force that 6 years earlier had barely been able to hold New York. Prime Minister Lord North reportedly received the news with his arms wide open and his face gone white, repeating, "It is all over. It is all over." It was not quite all over. The war continued in a technical sense for another 2 years, and British forces still held New York and Charleston. But the political will in Parliament to keep funding a conflict that had just produced Yorktown was gone, and everyone who mattered understood it. The Treaty of Paris was signed in September of 1783, and Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America in full. Lafayette was not present at the signing. He had returned to France before the treaty was concluded, arriving to a reception that caught him genuinely off guard. He was 24 years old and the most celebrated man in the country that was not his own. France had been following the American war through his letters, through the dispatches, through the newspapers, and what France saw was one of its own, young, wealthy, idealistic, who had crossed an ocean and helped win a revolution that the philosophes had been arguing was possible for a generation. He was exactly what the French Enlightenment had been theorizing about. He was proof. Washington wrote to him after the war with the kind of directness that their correspondence always had. Lafayette had been, he said, as dear to him as a son. That sentence requires a moment to sit with. Washington had no children of his own. Lafayette had lost his father at 2 years old. The war had given each of them, in the other, something they had spent their entire lives without.
What happened to Lafayette in the years after Yorktown is the part most people who know the first half of his story do not know, and it changes everything about how you read what he did in America. If you are not subscribed yet, hit subscribe now, because what comes in the next chapter is the part most history books quietly skip over. The French Revolution began in 1789 with the rhetoric of the American Revolution running through its veins. Liberty, rights, the consent of the governed, and Lafayette was at the center of it from the first weeks. He presented the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen to the National Assembly. He commanded the National Guard of Paris. He stood at the hinge point between the old France and whatever was coming next, and tried, with genuine conviction, to make the transition without the bloodshed that the most radical voices were already promising. He failed.
Not because he was wrong, but because the revolution he had helped inspire moved faster and darker than any moderate hand could steer. The terror came. The guillotine came. The country Lafayette had come home to as a hero turned on him as a moderate, a constitutionalist, a man who believed in limits. In 1792, he fled France and was immediately captured by Austrian forces and imprisoned. He spent 5 years in Austrian and Prussian prisons while Napoleon rose, while France remade itself in blood, while the country he had left America to come home to became something he did not recognize. Washington, who had his own reasons to be cautious about European entanglements, worked behind the scenes to secure Lafayette's release. He could not do it officially. He did it anyway, through diplomatic channels, through personal appeals, through the kind of quiet pressure that does not appear in official records, but produces results. Lafayette was released in 1797. He was 39 years old. He had spent 5 years in prison for the crime of believing that revolution did not have to mean massacre. He returned to France under Napoleon and spent the Napoleonic years in deliberate political retirement, watching from a distance, unwilling to serve a regime that had replaced one form of tyranny with another wearing a French coat. Lafayette came back to America one final time in 1824. He was 66 years old, walking with a cane from a hip he had broken years earlier, and he arrived at the invitation of President James Monroe to tour a country he had not seen in nearly 40 years. What followed was 13 months that neither Lafayette nor the Americans who lined the streets to see him had any framework to prepare for. He visited all 24 states. He attended dinners, ceremonies, military reviews. He stood at the sites of battles he had fought in as a young man and watched old soldiers come forward to shake his hand. Men who had been at Brandywine, at Valley Forge, at Yorktown. Men who were in their 60s and 70s now, and who had spent their entire adult lives in a country that existed in part because of what he had done when he was 19. He wept, repeatedly and without embarrassment, which was entirely consistent with the man who had been writing tender letters to Adrian since he was 16. Adrian did not make the trip. She had died in 1807, her health broken by the years of imprisonment during the Terror. Lafayette had been with her at the end. He wore a miniature portrait of her for the rest of his life, not in a pocket, not in a case, but around his neck, where he could put his hand to it. He did this until the day he died. He died on May 20th, 1834, in Paris. He was 76 years old. He is buried at Picpus Cemetery in Paris, in a grave filled with soil he had brought back from Bunker Hill. An American flag flies over it. The flag has flown continuously since his burial, maintained by American volunteers and later by the American Battle Monuments Commission. It is not a replica of an old tradition. It is the same tradition, uninterrupted, since 1834. Pay attention to that. Not a monument built afterward to honor a memory. A flag that never came down. Lafayette Square sits directly across from the White House in Washington, the most prominent public space in the American capital, named for a French teenager who showed up uninvited in 1777 and refused to leave until the job was done. Statues of him stand in New York, in Baltimore, in dozens of cities across the country he helped build. The town of Lafayette, Louisiana, Lafayette, Indiana, the Marquette-Lafayette Bridge in Detroit. The count runs into the hundreds. Cornwallis died in India in 1805, still serving, still advancing, having recovered his career in the way that British generals who lost wars on other continents sometimes managed to do. He never publicly revisited Yorktown or what it meant. He remained, until the end, the man who had written that he would destroy the boy. The boy outlived him by nearly 30 years. There is something in the Lafayette story that resists the categories we usually put around it. The foreign volunteer, the wealthy idealist, the young man who decided at a dinner in Metz that a revolution 3,000 miles away was worth dying for. None of those categories fully explain it. The closest explanation is also the simplest. He had something to prove. He had the resources to go prove it, and he never once confused the cost with the price. The king who tried to stop him ended up sending the fleet that won his war. If this story stayed with you, and I think it will, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment with this. Do you think Lafayette was driven more by the memory of his father, or by something he found in Washington that he had been looking for his whole life? That question splits the comments every single time, and I read every one of them.